First, I want to say that there will be no question and answer period, but there will be an opportunity to meet Helen Vendler and Harold Bloom in the reception area over there. Those doors come apart and there'll be a kind of, I think, goldfish and peanuts and something else in there. I wish it could be better, but Helen Vendler and Harold Bloom are America's best and best-known critics of poetry. In an academic climate that is so dismissive of poetry that it often seems antagonistic to it, they have become poetry's prime defenders. Helen Vendler's scrupulous, clarifying reading of poems, her high common sense that follows the thread of argument through the most ornate, some would say disordered, syntax, is virtuosic. Harold Bloom's enormous sympathy, which has conceived a tragic theater of influence where poems are elevated by the very texts they cannot replace, where connection or association means both ennoblement and diminishment, is deeply moving. Both critics have altered the way we read poetry. Both have kept poetry at the very center of their vision. And unlike others, they have not allowed ideology to diminish poetry to mere symptom or document, not allowed it to be relegated to the heap of outmoded human enterprises. In fact, what is exhilarating in reading Helen Vendler or Harold Bloom is that poetry for them is still the most human enterprise, the one in which our connection to forces we do not understand is not only intensely explored, but given a formal character or dimension that is transcendent. This evening represents a departure for our two critics in that they will not be reading papers, at least I don't think they will be, but instead will be reading some of their favorite poems and saying something about them, and they will be reading them as they feel they should be read. In other words, they shall be spokesmen for poetry in a slightly different way than they have been. Helen Vendler will read first, and Harold Bloom will read second. Helen Vendler.
I wanted to say a word about the principles of selection. There are some poems that are simply too long to read aloud. Ever since Gutenberg, poems have been written to be read on the page. And there's a limited amount that one can take in, at least I find it so, when I'm trying to take things in through the ear, especially if they're unfamiliar poems. So there are some poets and poems that I've omitted that are among my very favorite poems, but are too long to be read here tonight. I thought what I'd do is give this a slightly autobiographical shape and talk about coming to poetry and some poems that, short ones and ones that are easier apprehension, that meant a lot to me in my young days. Then I would talk about the poets that I've written books about. I'll read something from the poets I have written books about, and end with some contemporary poets whose works have meant a lot to me. I have also included, yes, I knew there was one more principle of organization. I've also included a fairly substantial number of Christmas and December and January poems, having some sense that poetry is one of the things that sings through the seasons over and over again every year, so that there should always be some seasonal poems. I began in adolescence with three poets who at the time seemed just, I don't know, casual acquisitions to me. Looking back, I now see that they probably had something to do with the sort of person I was. That is to say, I had been raised a Roman Catholic, that accounts for Hopkins. I was a woman, that accounts for Emily Dickinson. And I liked poetry, that accounts for Shakespeare. And so that is, in a way, some of these things have followed me all my life. I want to begin with two Views of Women by Emily Dickinson. When you're a young woman, you're interested to see how other women talk about women from the inside, so to speak, by contrast to the way men talk about women from the outside, if sometimes from the inside. Anyway, this is one of loss. The first poem is a poem about a woman friend who had become estranged from Emily Dickinson. Now I knew I lost her, not that she was gone, but, sorry, I didn't bring this one. Isn't this terrible? It's just stage fright. I'll skip it. I'll come back to it. The other one is the one about women where she's being critical of women. What soft, cherubic creatures these gentle women are. One would as soon assault a plush or violate a star. Such dimity convictions, a horror so refined of freckled human nature, of deity ashamed it's such a common glory, a fisherman's degree. Redemption, brittle lady, be so ashamed of thee. That's a nice one of the fierce spirit in her room rebuking the dimity convictions of her fellow women. I know the other one. Now I knew I lost her. Not that she was gone, but remoteness traveled on her face and tongue. Alien, though adjoining, as a foreign race, traversed she, though pausing, latitudeless place. Elements unaltered, universe the same, but love's transmigration, somehow this had come. Henceforth to remember, nature took the day I had paid so much for. His is penury, not who toils for freedom or for family, but the restitution of idolatry. Hopkins is best known, I suppose, as a religious poet, but I was not so much drawn by his religious poems at the time as by the poems in various ways about both nature and verse. And some of the most beautiful Hopkins poems I found in the back of the book among the fragments. And one of those shows you Hopkins at his most deeply engaged with his enormously sensitive and passionate responses to nature. It's simply a little poem about waking up in dawn, before the dawn really comes, but when night is really over, and seeing a moon gradually detach itself from the kind of fanged top of a mountain called Manifa, a Welsh mountain called Manifa. And it's a very beautiful, a long-lined poem. The lines are stopped in the middle by a caesura, and there are 4 beats to the left of the caesura and 3 beats to the right. I awoke in the midsummer not to call night, in the white and the walk of the morning. The moon dwindled and thinned to the fringe of a fingernail held to the candle, or paring of paradisaical fruit, lovely and waning but lustreless, stepped from the stool, drew back from the barrow of dark Manifa, the mountain. A cusp still clasped him, a fluke yet fanged him, entangled him, not quit utterly. This was the prized, the desirable sight, unsought, presented so easily, parted me leaf and leaf, divided me eyelid from eyelid of slumber. My third poet was Shakespeare, and one of my beginnings when I was young was to memorize a lot of Shakespeare's sonnets. And I didn't really have any sense of why I had done that. It just seemed to me something to do. It wasn't until much later, when I was cleaning out my mother's house after she had died, and she had had Alzheimer's disease for quite some time and was very frightened of losing her memory. She knew a great deal of poetry by heart. And I found page after page after page of small letter paper, note paper, with attempts that she was making to write down Shakespeare's sonnets by heart, the ones she knew, with gaps here and there where she couldn't remember the word. So I now know that I was memorizing Shakespeare's sonnets because my mother had. I didn't really realize that at the time. And I thought I'd read one of the ones that meant a lot to me then. I didn't know why, but it was my first taste, I suppose, of the whole Petrarchan tradition of adoring love. And I didn't understand why Shakespeare had done something in this in the second line until I heard Laurence Olivier in a very bad movie with Katharine Hepburn recite it to Katharine Hepburn, when the same sound, the sound I, is repeated 4 times, and it has been seen as a blemish by people talking about the poem. But Olivier realized that it was a lover's stammer, so with thanks to Olivier, I'll do it as he did it. To me, fair friend, you never can be old, for as you were when first your eye eyed, such seems your beauty still. 3 winters cold have from the forest shook 3 summers' pride. 3 beauteous springs to yellow autumn turned in process of the seasons have I seen. 3 April perfumes in 3 hot Junes burned since first I saw you fresh, which yet art green. Aye, yet doth beauty like a dial hand steal from his figure, and no pace perceived, and thy sweet hue, which methinks still doth stand, hath motion, and mine eye may be deceived. For fear of which, hear this thou age unbred, ere you were born, was beauty's summer dead. Those were my 3 first poets. When I went on, I wrote my dissertation on Yeats and didn't feel capable in my 20s of talking about these grand poems written by a man in his 50s, 60s, and 70s. So I stayed away from the poems and wrote instead on the vision and the plays, but I've kept teaching Yeats and writing bits and pieces on him ever since, so that he has stretched. I've been teaching in the Yeats Summer School from 1971 till now, so it's been a long portion of my life. And I thought I'd read to you, given the political climate these days, Yeats's poem in which he abhors all ideology, whether, as he says, it's Moscow preaching one side or Rome preaching the other side. At one point, he said that people would have to choose between himself, Lenin, and Pope Pius, whatever it was, the 11th, but this is a sort of spin-off from that version. It's a hymn to the 5 senses as the origins of poetry, and it's called Those Images. What if I bade you leave the cavern of the mind? There's better exercise in the sunlight and wind. I never bade you go to Moscow or to Rome. Renounce that drudgery, call the muses home. Seek those images that constitute the wild, the lion and the virgin, the harlot and the child. Find in middle air an eagle on the wing. Recognize the 5 that make the muses sing. And I want to read one other from Yeats. Sometimes when you teach a poet over many years, you think, especially if you've done a dissertation on the poet, as I had, you think you know everything when you finish your dissertation, of course, in some sense. And then you teach with great confidence that you know everything. And then 10 years go by and you don't teach Yeats. And suddenly it's time to teach Yeats again. And from the collected poems, a whole set of poems that you hadn't even noticed in your 20s float up in letters of gold on the page, and they are the poems for your 30s. In your 40s, the same thing happens. In your 50s, the same, and I confidently expect in my 60s, 70s, at least till I live as long as Yeats, if I do, the same thing will happen, that some subset of the poems that didn't mean much to me as a young woman will mean much more to me as a middle-aged woman or as an old woman. This is one of those that Yeats writes sardonically about his own accomplishments all through his life, and it's a brief autobiography. But then the mockery that the Platonic ideal that all artists see before them all the time, that perfect shape to which every shape they make is only an asymptotic approximation. When he sees that shape, which we usually think of as associated with the Platonic forms, it always mocks everything he's done, but he lets the shape speak in its originator's voice, in Plato's voice. The poem is called What Then? His chosen comrades thought at school he must grow a famous man. He thought the same and lived by rule all his 20s, crammed with toil. What then, sang Plato's ghost. What then? Everything he wrote was read. After certain years, he won sufficient money for his need. Friends that have been friends indeed. What then, sang Plato's ghost? What then? All his happier dreams came true. A small old house, wife, daughter, son, grounds where plum and cabbage grew. Poets and wits about him drew. What then, sang Plato's ghost? What then? The work is done, grown old, he thought, according to my boyish plan. Let the fools rage. I swerved in naught, something to perfection brought. But louder, sang that ghost. What then? That's a scary poem. After Yeats, I went on to write a book on Stevens, but since I've written a second little book on Stevens, I'm postponing the Stevens moment this evening and skipping over the first book I wrote on Stevens, which was on the long poems, which are irrelevant anyway, since you cannot sit still for the 800 lines of the Auroras of Autumn or something. And having written a book on the long poems of Stevens, I then wrote a little book on the short poems of Stevens with my simple categories firmly in hand. But I'm skipping that till I get to the short book, and I'm going to read a poem from the author I next wrote on, that is to say, George Herbert. When I wrote my book on George Herbert, my friend Marguerite said, "Oh, so at last you're writing about your mother, Helen." And only a best friend would have known that. But as Northrop Frye once said, all the best criticism is autobiography. And I think a good deal can be deduced from the books someone writes about the sort of person one is. There were many beautiful poems of George Herbert's, and I am divided even now. I Xeroxed up several of them to try to choose from at the very end. But I think I'll take his most autobiographical poem, especially for those who don't know Herbert's work, if I can only find his most autobiographical poem. I'm sure I brought it. Where has it disappeared to? I know here it is. Herbert, as you know, came from a wealthy Welsh family. His father died when he was young. He went on to Cambridge. He became the public orator at Cambridge, which meant that he greeted the king and other notables in Latin, speeches of welcome and so on. Then he decided to become an Anglican priest when he was 37. He was dead by the time he was 40 of tuberculosis, which was not then, of course, well known. It was usually referred to as agues. It had been expected that Herbert would go to court and become a courtier, which was the standard form of service in his family. And yet he eventually, one doesn't know whether under his mother's influence or not, became a priest, and whether under his mother's influence or not, married a cousin of his stepfather, his young stepfather. This is a poem called Affliction, in which Herbert reproaches God for most of the poem about how badly God has treated him and how strangely his life seems to have turned out. He knew he was talented, he knew he was aristocratic, he knew he was a scholar, and yet he was sitting around doing nothing, too sick to do anything, and unable to understand why God would make him so sick that he was unable to do any work for God at all. At the end, Herbert is thinking about the saying that a man cannot serve two masters. That is to say, there are only two masters. One is God and one is Satan. And to turn away from God is, of course, to choose the other master. This is a reproachful set of remarks to the Lord from his servant, Affliction. When first thou didst entice to thee my heart, I thought the service brave. So many joys I writ down for my part, besides what I might have out of my stock of natural delights, augmented with thy grace's perquisites. I looked on thy furniture so fine, and made it fine to me. Thy glorious household stuff did me entwine, and entice me unto thee. Such stars I counted mine. Both heaven and earth paid me my wages in a world of mirth. What pleasures could I want, whose king I served, where joys my fellows were? Thus, argued into hopes, my thoughts reserved no place for grief or fear. Therefore my sudden soul caught at the place, and made her youth and fierceness seek thy face. At first thou gavest me milk and sweetnesses. I had my wish and way. My days were strewed with flowers and happiness. There was no month but May. But with my years sorrow did twist and grow, and made a party unawares for woe. My flesh began unto my soul in pain. Sicknesses cleave my bones, consuming agues dwell in every vein, and tune my breath to groans. Sorrow was all my soul. I scarce believed till grief did tell me roundly that I lived. When I got health, thou took'st away my life and more, for my friends die. My mirth and edge was lost. A blunted knife was of more use than I. Thus thin and lean, without a fence or friend, I was blown through with every storm and wind. Whereas my birth and spirit rather took the way that takes the town, thou didst betray me to a lingering book and wrap me in a gown. I was entangled in the world of strife before I had the power to change my life. Yet, for I threatened oft the siege to raise, not simpering all mine age, thou often didst with academic praise melt and dissolve my rage. I took thy sweetened pill till I came near. I could not go away, nor persevere. Yet lest perchance I should too happy be in my unhappiness, turning my purge to food, thou throwest me into more sicknesses. Thus doth thy power cross-bias me, not making thine own gift good, yet me from my ways taking. Now I am here. What thou wilt do with me, none of my books will show. I read and sigh and wish I were a tree, for sure then I should grow to fruit or shade. At least some bird would trust her household to me, and I should be just. Yet though thou troublest me, I must be meek. In weakness must be stout. Well, I will change the service and go seek some other master out. O my dear God, though I am clean forgot, let me not love thee if I love thee not. From Herbert I went on to do a book on the Odes of Keats, but I'm not reading the Odes of Keats tonight, but rather two poems. One a December poem, from which Wallace Stevens borrowed to write his famous January poem, The Snowman. And I'm going to read The Snowman as my Stevens poem, so I want to read you In Drear Night of December first, because one is a spin-off from the other, so to speak. But I also like, for my own purposes, since it is my favorite poem of Keats, to read the Ode to Autumn. It's really called To Autumn. It's not, properly speaking, called an ode, partly because it is my favorite poem, and my close friend Marguerite again used to say that eventually I would be giving a seminar only on the Ode to Autumn, and for 14 weeks the children would have to read it over and over. There's something rather true about that. Oh, I'm sorry, there was one more Christmas poem. This is George Herbert's Christmas poem about the sun and himself singing together. He will shine, the sun will sing, and everybody will greet Christmas. The shepherds sing, and shall I silent be? My God, no hymn for thee? My soul's a shepherd too. A flock it feeds of thoughts and words and deeds. The pasture is thy word, the stream's thy grace, enriching all the place. Shepherd and flock shall sing, and all my powers outsing the daylight hours. Then we will chide the sun for letting night take up his place in right. We sing one common Lord, wherefore he should himself the candle hold. I will go searching till I find a sun shall stay when we have done, a willing shiner that shall shine as gladly as frost-nipped suns look sadly. Then we will sing and shine all our own day, and one another pay. His beams shall cheer my breast, and both so twine, till even his beams sing, and my music shine. Now, here's Keats's December poem. It's not a Christmas poem, December. And it's about our envy of the natural world, that it has no memory. We have a memory and therefore can look to past days and grieve over what we've lost. But a tree doesn't do that. A brook doesn't do that. When the winter comes, they don't think back to the springtime. But when our winter comes in our human seasons, we look back to our springtime. And when we try not to feel what our memories ask us to feel, and dull our sense of memory, it's an even worse feeling than remembering. In drear nighted December, too happy, happy tree, thy branches ne'er remember their green felicity. The north cannot undo them with the sleety whistle through them, nor frozen thawings glue them from budding at the prime. In drear nighted December, too happy, happy brook, thy bubblings ne'er remember Apollo's summer look, but with a sweet forgetting, they stay their crystal fretting, never, never petting about the frozen time. Ah, would 'twere so with many a gentle girl and boy. But were there ever any writhed not of passed joy? The feel of not to feel it, when there is none to heal it, nor numbed sense to steal it, was never said in rhyme. The feel of not to feel it was never said in rhyme. You have only to say that for the next poet in Harold Bloom's Anxiety of Influence, to say, never been said? I'll say it. So the feel of not to feel it, not to feel, not to hear, comes in The Snowman by Wallace Stevens, who suggests that you could be a snowman. You could try to imitate the frozen brook and not to pet about the frozen time. And you could try, instead of saying, where are all the green leaves that I liked so much, to say, look at the beautiful snow and ice hanging on the evergreens. That is to say, there's always something to look at, even in your human season of winter. But it's hard not to let regret for the fallen leaves creep back in, and it's hard to make yourself look again at exactly what is in the scene and not to see anything of the past shadowing it as a kind of after-image of spring. The Snowman. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place for the listener who listens in the snow and, nothing himself, beholds nothing that is not there and the nothing that is. I pass from here to contemporaries, and I think the best part of my life came when by accident I began through the kind offices of the Massachusetts Review to write about contemporary poetry. It was to make money, and my first volume of essays was dedicated to my son because it put him through high school, college, and so forth, by writing for these various places. But I found it very interesting to write about people who were writing down my life as it went along, so to speak, at this very moment. And though I've been brought up on the English tradition, I was most interested in contemporary American poets who seemed to be creating our culture, making up life as we went along, all in the murk of it. So that I would like to read, not in any particular order, I don't suppose. First, I suppose, when I became a young mother, I was struck, since I had been accompanied through life by poems from the time I could remember, from my earliest memory. I always had poems to hand. There were love poems, there were death poems, there were grief poems, there were travel poems, everything. Suddenly there were no motherhood poems. This was very enraging because you didn't know how to think about anything until you had read a poem about it. And so the few motherhood poems I found, I was extremely grateful for. There weren't that many daughter poems either. And I remember being extremely grateful to read a poem about daughterhood called The Middle-Aged by Adrienne Rich when I was becoming an adult daughter and not knowing what to make of that either. The poem I'm going to read by Rich is a marriage poem, a very funny marriage poem, although she's not usually funny, but I think this one is very funny. And this is from her poem called Shooting Script. And I think she was the first contemporary poet that I guess I began reading Lowell before I read Rich, but then a friend of Rich's who knew her gave me a first edition of her first book, A Change of World, the Yale Younger Poetry book, and had Adrienne inscribe it for me, and so I began reading her with her first book. But this is a much later version of Adrienne Rich. This is seen from the point of view of women, what courtship and marriage are like. And of course, it's a deeply ironic and sardonic view of courtship and marriage, as you would expect from Rich. And the they in the poem is men who want to marry you, and you is the woman. They come to you with their descriptions of your soul. You are such a sweet-tempered girl, and you think, oh God, what if he finds out? They come to you with their descriptions of your soul. They come and drop their mementos at the foot of your bed, their feathers, ferns, fans, grasses from the western mountains, all those courtship tokens. They wait for you to unfold for them like a paper flower, a secret springing open in a glass of water. They believe your future has a history, and it is themselves. They have family trees to plant for you, photographs of dead children, old bracelets and rings they want to fasten onto you. And in spite of this, you live alone. Your secret hangs in the open like Poe's purloined letter. Their longing and their methods will never let them find it. Your secret cries out in the dark and hushes. When they start out of sleep, they think you are innocent. You hang among them like the icon of a Russian play, living your own intenser life behind the lamp they light in front of you. You are spilt here like mercury on a marble counter, liquefying into many globes, each silvered like a planet caught in a lens. You are a mirror lost in a brook, an eye reflecting a torrent of reflections. You are a letter written, folded, burnt to ash, and mailed in an envelope to another continent. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me, said Emily Dickinson. When I first read Sylvia Plath's poems, it was because my parents had known the Plaths when we were children, and Sylvia and her parents had moved away, but we used to get a Christmas note every year from Aurelia Plath saying that Sylvia had poems coming out in 17 or something. And it seemed so extraordinary that somebody only a year older than I was writing poems that were actually being printed, since I was writing a lot of poems myself at the same time, needless to say. I used to follow these appearances with great interest. So I always followed her career too from the beginning, and was made very unhappy by her end and by the stresses that preceded that end in her own mental makeup. I just saw that Sotheby's is auctioning off a copy, I think it was the new TLS, that Sotheby's is auctioning off a copy of an abnormal psychology textbook that had been owned by Plath, with many sections, said the TLS, heavily underlined, manic depressive psychosis, paranoia. I mean, so she was not unaware. But she wrote some of the most beautiful poems about children, and having been an exceptional child herself, she wanted her children to have less distinguished destinies than she did. And she felt herself, because of her singularity and her depressions, to be an unfit mother for this beautiful little boy that she had just had, little Nicholas. And so she wrote a poem which expresses the worrying of every neurotic mother about how she can possibly be a decent mother to this beautiful newborn object, which is so innocent and clear-eyed as yet, child. Your clear eye is the one absolutely beautiful thing. I want to fill it with color and ducks, the zoo of the new whose names you meditate, April's snowdrop, Indian pipe, little stalk without wrinkle, pool in which images should be grand and classical, not this troublous wringing of hands, this dark ceiling without a star. One's children, however, grow up, and the Oedipal rivalries begin. And one of my favorite poems about children preparing in secret to ambush their parents and do better whatever their parents have done so that they can put the old man in the shade, so to speak, which is somehow evilly present even in very little children. As this charming poem by Dave Smith says, Dave Smith, who of course spends his time writing books, and then he finds out, what are the children doing? They're writing books too. They come to say goodnight to their father. And this is the sort of house where the main rooms are on the main floor and the bedrooms are down, and den and so forth are down in the bottom floor. Reading the books our children have written. They come into the room while the quail are crying to huddle up, the canyon winds just beginning. They pass my big brown desk, their faces damp and glistening like the first peaches washed, and offer themselves to be kissed. I am their father still. I kiss them. I say, see you tomorrow. Their light steps fade down the stairs, what they are saying like the far stars, shrill, hard to understand. They are saying their father writes a book, and they are in it, for they are his children. Then they lie in their beds, waiting for sleep, sometimes singing. Later, I get up and go down in darkness and find the hour they played before they were scrubbed, before they brought me those faces. There on the floor, I find the stapled pages, the strange, mild countenances of animals no one has ever seen, the tall, dark man who writes an endless story of birds homeless in the night. They have numbered every page. They have named each colorful wing. They have done all this to surprise me, surprising themselves. On the last lined yellow page, one has written, "This is a poem." Under this, the other one has answered, "See tomorrow." I promised to autumn, but I think I'll skip it. I've already headed on to contemporaries. And I would like to read one other poem about children called School Children by Louise Glick. This is the horror that every mother faces when she finally has to send her children off to her child off to the first grade, where nobody will love it. And you are in that craven and propitiatory mood towards the teachers, willing to do anything, an apple for the teacher, if they will only be nice to your child. The school children. The children go forward with their little satchels, and all morning the mothers have labored to gather the late apples, red and gold, like words of another language. And on the other shore are those who wait behind great desks to receive these offerings. How orderly they are, the nails on which the children hang their overcoats of blue or yellow wool. And the teachers shall instruct them in silence, and the mothers shall scour the orchards for a way out, drawing to themselves the gray limbs of the fruit trees, bearing so little ammunition. That's a terrific one when you send your child off to the first grade. I want to read a poem that is oddly inspiriting, although it affects to be depressing, you might say. And this is a poem written against the grain by Charles Wright, who's here tonight, called The New Poem. This is a manifesto. And of course, the old ethical ways and civic ways of teaching poetry were sort of awful. All the poems you learned in school, I speak from having seen the list that Cambridge students were supposed to learn when E. Cummings was going to school in Cambridge, and it was exactly the same poems my mother was supposed to learn when she was in the Boston high schools at precisely the same time. So clearly that was the regimen. Mostly it was Barbara Fritchie or the old bridge, the Concord Bridge, or things like that. Or if it wasn't that, it was morally uplifting. The subversive side of poetry was never allowed in, and poetry was taught, in fact, as something that would help you, as Wallace Stevens said, live your life. And it does, of course, but you get sick of a country where every single bit of emphasis put on poetry is that it can be ethical and consolatory and help you through as though it were a sort of hospice nurse. So this is the new poem in this manifesto. Also, of course, poems were about nature. That was also safe to put in school books. I think that, I will never see a poem lovely as a tree, because that's not subversive either. But this is the new poem by Charles Wright. It will not resemble the sea. It will not have dirt on its thick hands. It will not be part of the weather. It will not reveal its name. It will not have dreams you can count on. It will not be photogenic. It will not attend our sorrow. It will not console our children. It will not be able to help us. And that's a call to America to wake up, of course. I also want to read a poem by our laureate, which I asked his permission to read because I thought he might not want it read aloud, but he said I could read it. It's one of my favorite poems about adolescence. There'll be another poem about adolescence in a moment. This one is called Courtship, and it's about the gauche by Mark Strand. It's about the gaucherie and fumbling and horrors of adolescent sexual gropings and terrors and miseries and fears. Courtship. There is a girl you like, so you tell her your penis is big, but that you cannot get yourself to use it. Its demands are ridiculous, you say, even self-defeating. But to be honored somehow, briefly, inconspicuously, in the dark. When she closes her eyes in horror, you take it all back. You tell her you're almost a girl yourself, and you can understand why she is shocked. When she is about to walk away, you tell her you have no penis, that you don't know what got into you. You get on your knees. She suddenly bends down to kiss your shoulder, and you know you're on the right track. You tell her you want to bear children, and that is why you seem confused. You wrinkle your brow and curse the day you were born. She tries to calm you, but you lose control. You reach for her panties and beg forgiveness as you do. She squirms, and you howl like a wolf. Your craving seems monumental. You know you will have her. Taken by storm, she is the girl you will marry. As you get older, of course, you think about things that your parents did for which you never thanked them at the time. And I wanted to read a poem that struck me very strongly by a poet now dead named Robert Hayden. We too, like the Haydens apparently, had a coal furnace, and it was my father's duty. This was one of those gender-segregated tasks, to go down in the morning and push the lever back and forth and shake down the embers from the banked fires that had burned in the coal furnace during the night, then to put more coal on and to turn the furnace up again and get everything warm so that the rest of us could get up and be warm instead of freezing cold. When I read this poem, it seemed eerie, as though it was a poem waiting in the air for someone to pluck it out and write it. Those winter Sundays. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in that blue-black cold. Then, with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? I must close, so I'll close with one other Christmas poem, you might say. This is by Jory Graham, and it's called San Sepolcro, and it's about a famous painting by Piero della Francesca called La Madonna del Parto, which shows Mary about to give birth, very largely pregnant, standing in a blue dress that fills the whole canvas, more or less, and she's just beginning to unbutton the buttons of her dress. And there are two angels holding up curtains, and they're about to let the curtains down because, of course, we're not allowed to witness the birth of God. And so it's just the moment before Christ is born. And this hangs in Borgo San Sepolcro in Italy, and this is where Graham now is. It's a funny mixture of this Christian painting, some Etruscan wall sections, lemon trees that are growing next door, and an airplane factory down below that assembles, in the modern part of town, the bodies and wings of the machinery into airplanes. And this will be the last one I'll read. San Sepolcro. This is, of course, a poem about going into labor, or being afraid of what that entails, and also being afraid of what it entails to go into any large giving birth, whether giving birth of verse or giving birth to a poem or anything, or a god. San Sepolcro. The whole light of the painting, as I've said, is blue from Mary's robe. In this blue light, I can take you there, snow having made me a world of bone seen through to. This is my house, my section of Etruscan wall, my neighbor's lemon trees, and just below the lower church, the airplane factory. A rooster crows all day from mist outside the walls. There's milk on the air, ice on the oily lemon skins. How clean the mind is, holy grave. It is this girl by Piero della Francesca, unbuttoning her blue dress, her mantle of weather, to go into labor. Come, we can go in. It is before the birth of God. No one has risen yet to the museums, to the assembly line, bodies and wings, to the open air market. This is what the living do, go in. It's a long way. And the dress keeps opening from eternity to privacy, quickening. Inside, at the heart, is tragedy, the present moment forever stillborn. But going in, each breath is a button coming undone, something terribly nimble-fingered, finding all of the stops. Thank you.
I want to read 8 poems if there is time. I think probably the only common feature they have is that all of them are what I would call elegies for the self. The first one some of you may not know. It's undoubtedly the finest anonymous poem in the English language. It's the great Tom of Bedlam song, which was preserved in a literary scrapbook, a manuscript commonplace of about 1620. Its power is so great, it sometimes seems to me the finest lyrical poem in the English language, that I've always had the fantasy, though there's not the slightest evidence for this, that Shakespeare himself may well have written it. It's also a poem much on my mind these days as I walk around New York City, where I tend to spend a lot of time, where the Reagan and Bush administrations have given us about 100,000 homeless. Many of them are schizophrenic. This great Mad song, which is a begging song, moves finally into that realm of poetic vision, which may be allied to madness, but clearly transcends anything we know. So this is the great song, sometimes called Roaring Mad Tom or Tom of Bedlam. From the hag and hungry goblin that interacts with Renji, the spirit that stands by the naked man in the Book of Moons defend ye, that of your 5 sound senses ye never be forsaken, nor wander from yourselves with Tom abroad to beg your bacon, while I do sing any food, any feeding, drink, or clothing. Come, dame or maid, be not afraid, poor Tom will injure nothing. Of 30 bare years have I twice 20 been enraged, and of 40 been 3 times 15 in durance soundly caged. On the lordly lofts of Bedlam, with stubble soft and dainty, brave bracelets strong, sweet whips, ding-dong, with wholesome hunger plenty. And now I sing any food, any feeding, drink, or clothing. Come, dame or maid, be not afraid, poor Tom will injure nothing. With a thought I took for maudlin and a cruise of cockle pottage, with a thing thus tall, sky bless you all, I befell into this dotage. I slept not since the conquest. Till then I never waked to the roguish boy of love where I lay, me found and stripped me naked. And now I sing any food, any feeding, drink, or clothing. Come, dame or maid, be not afraid, poor Tom will injure nothing. I know more than Apollo, for oft when he lies sleeping, I see the stars at bloody wars and the wounded welkin weeping. The moon embrace her shepherd, and the queen of love her warrior, while the first doth horn the star of morn, and the next the heavenly farrier. While I do sing any food, any feeding, drink, or clothing, come, dame or maid, be not afraid, poor Tom will injure nothing. The gypsies, Snap and Pedro, are none of Tom's camarados. The punk I scorn, and the cutburst swan, and the roaring boys' bravados. The meek, the white, the gentle, me handle, touch, and spare not. But those that cross Tom Rhinoceros do what the panther dare not. Yet do I sing any food, any feeding, drink, or clothing. Come dame or maid, be not afraid, poor Tom will injure nothing. With an host of furious fancies, whereof I am commander, with a burning spear and a horse of air, to the wilderness I wander. By a night of ghosts and shadows, I summoned am to tourney 10 leagues beyond the wide world's end. Methinks it is no journey. Yet I do sing any food, any feeding, drink, or clothing. Come dame or maid, be not afraid. Poor Tom will injure nothing. I want to switch now to a poem I've loved since I was 13. I guess most of these poems I've loved since I was 13. Indeed, most of them I'll read from an anthology that I was given in October 1943. This is the extraordinary elegiac poem by the great American poet Edwin Arlington Robinson, the highly incantatory Luke Havergal. Go to the western gate, Luke Havergal. There where the vines cling crimson on the wall, and in the twilight wait for what will come. The leaves will whisper there of her, and some like flying words will strike you as they fall. But go, and if you listen, she will call. Go to the western gate, Luke Havergal, Luke Havergal. No, there is not a dawn in eastern skies to rift the fiery night that's in your eyes, but there, where western glooms are gathering, the dark will end the dark, if anything. God slays himself with every leaf that flies, and hell is more than half of paradise. No, there is not a dawn in eastern skies, Out of a grave I come to tell you this. Out of a grave I come to quench the kiss that flames upon your forehead with a glow that blinds you to the way that you must go. Yes, there is yet one way to where she is, bitter, but one that faith may never miss. Out of a grave I come to tell you this, There is the western gate, Luke Havergal. There are the crimson leaves upon the wall. Go, for the winds are tearing them away, nor think to riddle the dead words they say, nor any more to feel them as they fall. But go, and if you trust her, she will call. There is the western gate, Luke Havergal, Luke Havergal. The next poem is the astonishing poem of the greatest of laureates, Alfred Lord Tennyson, the great dramatic monologue called Ulysses, a poem that is an immense problematic. Because of it, Tennyson always said that he had written it after the death of Helen in order to express the feeling of the necessity for going on, and yet the poem is profoundly equivocal. It is based upon the speech of Dante's Ulysses down in the deepest part of hell, speaking out of the flame to a Dante who's in fact struck dumb and cannot respond to what Ulysses is saying. And the final lines incontrovertibly echo, deliberately, I think, recall one of the greatest of the speeches of Satan in Book 1 of Paradise Lost. So it is the speech of what we would traditionally call a hero-villain, in some ways more hero than villain, but nevertheless it is an astonishing monologue and an astonishing chant in its way. It little profits that an idle king, by this still hearth among these barren crags, matched with an aged wife, I meet and dole unequal laws unto a savage race that hoard and sleep and feed and know not me. I cannot rest from travel. I will drink life to the lees. All times I have enjoyed greatly, have suffered greatly, both with those that loved me and alone. On shore, and when through scudding drifts the rainy Hyades vexed the dim sea, I am become a name. For always roaming with a hungry heart, much have I seen and known. Cities of men and manners, climates, councils, governments, myself not least, but honored of them all, and drunk delight of battle with my peers far on the ringing plains of windy Troy. I am a part of all that I have met, yet all experience is an arch wherethrough gleams that untraveled world, whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. How dull it is to pause, to make an end, to rust unburnished, not to shine in use, as though to breathe were life. Life piled on life were all too little, and of one to me little remains. But every hour is saved from that eternal silence, something more, a bringer of new things. And vile it were for some 3 suns to store and hoard myself, and this gray spirit yearning in desire to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bound of human thought. This is my son, mine own Telemachus, to whom I leave the scepter and the isle, well loved of me, discerning to fulfill this labor by slow prudence to make mild a rugged people, and through soft degrees subdue them to the useful and the good. Most blameless is he, centered in the sphere of common duties, decent not to fail in offices of tenderness, and pay meet adoration to my household gods when I am gone. He works his work, I mine. There lies the port, the vessel puffs her sail. There gloom the dark, broad seas, my mariners, souls that have toiled and wrought and thought with me, that ever with a frolic welcome took the thunder and the sunshine, and opposed free hearts, free foreheads. You and I are old. Old age hath yet his honor and his toil. Death closes all. But something ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with gods. The lights begin to twinkle from the rocks, the long day wanes, the slow moon climbs, the deep moans round with many voices. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. The echo of Milton's Satan, of course, is unmistakable there at the close. Like Helen, I want to read one poem of Emily Dickinson's. It is a poem that has always both frightened and charmed me, a poem in which wit is carried to the point of a kind of sublime ecstasy. The famous Because I Could Not Stop for Death, in which, of course, everything depends upon our realizing that it is a poem based upon the social position of being Miss Dickinson of Amherst, a single woman. She cannot take her carriage and stop at the residence of death. She cannot make a call upon him. He must do her the courtesy of making a call upon her. He proceeds to do so. A duenna, or chaperone, immortality, is in the carriage with them, but as she slyly observes, he tricks her anyway. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children played, their lessons scarcely done. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling on the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice but a mound. Since then, 'tis centuries, but each feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. I want to move now to two poems of immense anguish, elegies for the self, indeed. The first, Hart Crane's great death poem, The Broken Tower, written in Mexico when he came out of one of his terrible drunken binges and out of having been jailed by the Mexican police and being greatly startled as he crossed the lawn of the shutdown, since this was revolutionary Mexico, Mexican City Cathedral, by hearing a sexton ring the bells that became for him an extraordinary metaphor or trope for the relationship of his own amazing poetic gift to his own immensely troubled and anguished being. And he writes the great elegy, I think sometimes of all of modern American poetry, called The Broken Tower, in which clearly he himself is that tower. The bell rope that gathers God at dawn dispatches me as though I dropped down the knell of a spent day to wander the cathedral lawn from pit to crucifix, feet chill on steps from hell. Have you not heard? Have you not seen that corps of shadows in the tower, whose shoulders sway antiphonal carillons launched before the stars are caught and hived in the sun's ray? The bells, I say, the bells break down their tower and swing I know not where. Their tongues engrave membrane through marrow, my long scattered score of broken intervals, and I, their sexton slave. Oval encyclicals and canyons heaping the impasse high with choir, banked voices slain, pagodas, campaniles with reveilles outleaping, O terraced echoes prostrate on the plain. And so it was I entered the broken world to trace the visionary company of love, its voice an instant in the wind, I know not whither hurled, but not for long to hold each desperate choice. My word I poured, but was it cognate, scored of that tribunal monarch of the air, whose thigh embronzes earth, strikes crystal word in wounds pledged once to hope, cleft to despair? The steep encroachments of my blood left me no answer. Could blood hold such a lofty tower as flings the question true? Or is it she whose sweet mortality stirs latent power, and through whose pulse I hear, counting the strokes, my veins recall and add, revived and sure, the undulus of wars my chest evokes, what I hold healed, original now and pure, and builds within a tower that is not stone can jacket heaven, but slip of pebbles, visible wings of silence sewn in azure circles, widening as they dip the matrix of the heart, lift down the eye that shrines the quiet lake and swells a tower. The commodious tall decorum of that sky unseals her earth and lifts love in its shower. Then I think very much the parallel poem, not that Crane had it in mind, or perhaps had ever read it, the great poem in which William Cooper, the 18th century Wesleyan poet, as I suppose he has to be called, who went through so many bursts of schizophrenia and immense depression, summoning up his life using the giant metaphor of a sailor swept from on board whom no one can rescue, the castaway. Obscurest night involved the sky. The Atlantic billows roared, when such a destined wretch as I washed headlong from on board, of friends, of hope, of all bereft, his floating home forever left. No braver chief could Albion boast than he with whom he went, nor ever ship left Albion's coast with warmer wishes sent. He loved them both, but both in vain, nor him beheld, nor her again. Not long beneath the whelming brine, expert to swim, he lay, nor soon he felt his strength decline, or courage die away, but waged with death a lasting strife, supported by despair of life. He shouted, nor his friends had failed to check the vessel's course, but so the furious blast prevailed that pitiless perforce they left their outcast mate behind and scudded still before the wind. Some succor yet they could afford, and such as storms allow, the cask, the coop, the floated cord, delayed not to bestow, but he they knew, nor ship, nor shore, whate'er they gave, should visit more. Nor, cruel as it seemed, could he their haste himself condemn, aware that flight in such a sea alone could rescue them. Yet bitter felt it still to die deserted, and his friends so nigh. He long survives, who lives an hour in ocean, self-upheld, and so long he with unspent power his destiny repelled, and ever as the minutes flew, entreated help or cried adieu. At length, his transient respite past, his comrades who before had heard his voice in every blast could catch the sound no more. For then, by toil subdued, he drank the stifling wave, and then he sank. No poet wept him, but the page of narrative sincere that tells his name, his worth, his age, is wet with Anson's tear. And tears by bards or heroes shed alike immortalize the dead. I therefore purpose not or dream, descanting on his fate, to give the melancholy theme a more enduring date. But misery still delights to trace its semblance in another's case. No voice divine the storm allayed, no light propitious shone. When snatched from all effectual aid, we perished, each alone. But I beneath a rougher sea, and whelmed in deeper gulfs than he. Finally, two poems of the 20th century. First, The Unbeliever by the late Elizabeth Bishop. I must have introduced Miss Bishop at 4, perhaps 5 poetry readings, whether in New Haven or New York. I invariably asked her to read this poem. Twice she said yes reluctantly, twice or 3 times she said, no, Professor Bloom, you like the poem a lot more than I do. I still, great poet as she was, like it best of all her poems. It's based on a great trope or metaphor of John Bunyan's in The Pilgrim's Progress, where Bunyan says, unforgettably of any one of us who is an unbeliever, he sleeps on the top of a mast. And here are Miss Bishop's extraordinary variations on that line. He sleeps on the top of a mast, with his eyes fast closed. The sails fall away below him like the sheets of his bed, leaving out in the air of the night the sleeper's head. Asleep, he was transported there. Asleep, he curled in a gilded ball on the mast's top, or climbed inside a gilded bird, or blindly seated himself astride. I am founded on marble pillars, said a cloud. I never move. See the pillars there in the sea? Secure in introspection, he peers at the watery pillars of his reflection. A gull had wings under his, and remarked that the air was like marble. He said, up here I tower through the sky, for the marble wings on my tower top fly. But he sleeps on the top of his mast, with his eyes closed tight. The gull inquired into his dream, which was, I must not fall. The spangled sea below wants me to fall. It is hard as diamonds. It wants to destroy us all. One last poem, and this, I suppose, is my favorite short poem in all the world. And here, I guess, since I do have a little time, though I don't want to lecture to you, I'll talk a little bit about the poem before I read it. This is Wallace Stevens's poem called The Poems of Our Climate. It's a kind of still life. It is a poem, in a sense, about a flower arrangement. There are a lot of poems that Helen likes, and even though I like Helen enormously, I don't like those poems. I don't like a lot of contemporary poems which have any kind of deeply and directly confessional aspect. I don't like poems that get involved in contemporary cultural politics, not that Helen necessarily likes those either. I am, I suppose, beginning to be something I could never have conceived of, what Alan Tate, not a gentleman I ever got along with, called a reactionary critic. But if I am that, I think, only in the name of what I understand to be the strongest elements in the poetic tradition, not, I would insist, in terms of societal choices of any kind, not because I am interested in the oppression of women or the oppression of any minority group whatsoever. Stevens wrote poems which are as far away from deliberate self-revelation or personal confession as poems could possibly be. But they are poems of such perfect craft and such genius of absolute inwardness that when you come to know them deeply, you are blinded by the terrible revelations that Stevens makes not only about himself, but about everything in your own nature, and I mean everyone in this room, whoever you are, and my own nature, that we share with Stevens. That is to say, he was a profoundly subjective poet, not a confessional poet. And even though there are now plenty of critics, many of them encased at Duke University, who assure us that he was speaking for a particular social class, and is indeed now to be counted among those dreadful fellows, the dead white European males, in this case, a dead white American male, I think these things will pass. These slogans will pass. Here is this overwhelming poem of total human revelation, ostensibly about flower arrangement, but about the totality of any person's existence. The Poems of Our Climate. Clear water in a brilliant bowl, pink and white carnations. The light in the room more like a snowy air reflecting snow, a newly fallen snow at the end of winter when afternoons return. Pink and white carnations, one desires so much more than that. The day itself is simplified, a ball of white, cold, a cold porcelain, low and round, with nothing more than the carnations there. Say even that this complete simplicity stripped one of all one's torments, concealed the evilly compounded vital I, and made it fresh in a world of white, a world of clear water, brilliant edged. Still, one would want more. One would need more than a world of white and snowy scents. There would still remain the never-resting mind, so that one would want to escape, come back to what had been so long composed. The imperfect is our paradise. Note that in this bitterness, delight, since the imperfect is so hot in us, lies in flawed words and stubborn sounds. Thank you.